Hello, good morning, and good day. Thank you and a warm welcome to all of you joining for this timely and important conversation being hosted as part of the Environmental Divide in this year's Victoria Forum theme of Bridging Divides in the Wake of a Global Pandemic. We're delighted to have you with us. I know we're gathering virtually today, but before going any further, I want to use this opportunity to express my gratitude and respect for the stewardship of the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory I and the University of Victoria stand, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and WSÁNEĆ peoples who have long held and ongoing relationships with this land and its surrounding waters. Over the last 2 weeks, the world has watched with rapt attention as the single largest and most powerful Western democracy went to the polls, revealing not only which side would rule and which vision would take precedence over the next 4 years, but also the distance between the two and those that identify with each vision. On the ballot were not only questions around values and representation, but also more fundamental ones around justice and authority, or put differently, who can speak truth to power, and ultimately, what is truth? While the contradictions and questions at the heart of the democratic project have preoccupied philosophers and thinkers for centuries, many of us have, for the most part, been in the fortunate position of being able to take the benefits of scientific advance and systems of governance largely for granted. But lately, shifting sentiment and increasing polarization around the world have brought into sharper focus the questions of how, and indeed if, the structures of democracy are delivering on what we need as a society and from those in power. One of the issues in which these complexities and divisions are made most plain is that of climate change. Over the last decade and more, we have learned that scientific consensus simply isn't enough to drive decisive and necessary action on climate. We've seen the failure of international cooperation and policymaking, and we have learned that despite extensive efforts, the prospect of meeting our 2030 global climate targets is thin. Our discussion today considers these questions and the institutions, mechanisms, and innovations that could help us to change this trajectory, to bend the arc not only back towards a just future, but more urgently towards a safe and resilient one. Our speakers will examine opportunities for action from different perspectives and different parts of the world that speak to these challenges and opportunities and highlight solutions for our common future. For those of us that work in the field of climate change and on the mobilization of climate solutions, like us at the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, there are few more crucial questions governing what we do and how we do it. It is therefore my great pleasure to have with us today an outstanding group of leading thinkers, advocates, and experts who will share their experiences, insights, and provocations on this topic. I will introduce each of them in turn and where possible, accept questions in the chat of this webinar for consideration during the Q&A. To begin our conversation today, I would like to first welcome Richard Florizone. Earlier this year, Richard became the president and CEO of the International Institute for Sustainable Development, and soon after chair of the Task Force for Resilient Recovery, which he will be talking about today. Richard is considered part scientist and part strategist and has a strong record of forging collaborative partnerships and building institutions and communities that are intelligent, inclusive, and inspiring. Originally from Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, Richard has held senior roles with the Boston Consulting Group, Cambridge University, Bombardier, and the International Finance Corporation. He holds a PhD in physics from MIT, is a fellow of the Canadian Academy of Engineering, and president emeritus for Dalhousie University. Thank you very much for joining us, Richard, and over to you.
Thank you, Christy. Thank you for the invitation, and to our attendees and my fellow panelists. I really look forward to the conversation today. So I just want to kick us off with a few thoughts and maybe go deep into this task force as a case study. You know, the title, Christy, for the session I noted included the phrase signposts for a more resilient future. Signposts for a more resilient future. Well, if you picture that signpost and deal with that metaphor, you know, picture that signpost, clearly the road ahead on which that signpost sits is an uncertain road. It's going to be one with lots of twists and turns, as the past year has demonstrated to us. But what I'd say is, if there's one signpost that I firmly believe in, is that signpost will say, partnerships ahead. We seem to be in an era, as one of my colleagues has called it, an era of multi-stakeholder partnerships. And in an increasingly fragmented and polarized world, I believe that there will be increased calls for us to find common cause, to find these novel kinds of partnerships, sometimes with people we're not accustomed to working with, to drive the progress we want to see. So in a few minutes, I want to just talk to you, as I suppose as a case study, that type of partnership, something called the Task Force for Resilient Recovery. I'll just bring up I have a handful of slides. Apologies. I think I'm the only one on the panel who's going to inflict PowerPoint on the audience, so I promise to keep it brief. I'm here to talk about recovery. First off, who it is, and then I'll tell you what it tried to do. The task force came together in March, kind of as the pandemic was, I suppose, really taking hold in North America. And, I think all of us agreed that government's first priorities had to be and must be, continues to be, to fight the virus and to deal with the impact of those most directly affected, the individuals on the front lines, the businesses, keeping them afloat. That was job 1 and 2, if you will. But what brought us together was sort of, I guess, what is job 3, which is beyond the virus and its immediate impact. How do we think about the longer term? And so a lot of us were thinking about how we could advise government to come together for a resilient recovery, and we decided to join forces. So it was quite an independent effort. We tried to be fairly apolitical in the sense that those of you who are Canadian might recognize Jerry Butts, of course, a prominent Liberal, former Secretary Chief Advisor to Prime Minister Trudeau. But we also drew from the NDP and Liberals, folks like Mira Orrick, who've been a close advisor to BC Premier John Horgan and Mitch Davidson, active in Conservative circles. Tried to get a bit of a private sector kind of perspective as well from the Insurance Bureau of Canada, from Andy Chisholm, who's a chair of, or rather as a board member of Royal Bank of Canada, and a whole range of folks from across the spectrum, including some with a great finance background like Barb's Van, who was with the Teachers Pension Plan, and Maren Smith, who many of you will know, I think, from Clean Energy Canada. So what did we try to do? Our goal was really to kind of to make Canada's economic recovery from COVID resilient, and that's a broad word. It means a lot of things. The way that we defined it was getting Canadians back to work while supporting the jobs of the future. And so we knew that resilient recovery needed to count for a lot of other things. There were health and social dimensions that we could speak to, but we wanted to focus on these really 3 principles, for the next 1 to 5 years to ensure that we don't lock in kind of a high carbon pathway. As we look at those measures, can we keep in mind what is going around the world? So have a global perspective. But we also wanted to be bottom up. We're intentionally Canadian and looking for existing ideas across Canada that would feed into a net zero and climate resilient future. And we tried to kind of weigh everything or design everything according to kind of 3 criteria, both the economic impact, realizing that people were really concerned about jobs, but also trying to frankly reject that false compromise between the economy and environment, and also look for equitable solutions. So a lot of this will sound familiar to you. The backdrop to it, of course, is what is going on around the world. So very significant investments. Many of us, I think, on this call will know of the big announcements in Europe, but there's also been quite a few in Asia. So that the EU multi-year budget, where over 30% of it was committed to green measures over 10 years this summer, but also their biodiversity strategy. If you take all that, it's well over $1 trillion over a decade that's dedicated to green recovery. And you add to that, of course, investments from member countries in the EU like Germany and France, you get very significant investments. One of the things I think that's always interesting to point out for a North American audience is that in the UK, you're seeing a strong, relatively strong commitment to this. I think some folks in North America would be surprised to know that a conservative-led government in the UK has actually advocated for things like bike lanes, and this has actually accelerated the ban on future sales of gasoline and diesel powered vehicles. And then, of course, in the U.S., when we did our work, this was pre-election, but we have the very significant $2 trillion U.S. or 2.7 billion Canadian Biden proposal, which, when you put this into context, what we were trying to say to Canadians is, look, there's major movement happening here around the world. The EU deal has captured a lot of attention. It works out to about $2,000 per capita in Canada, but the Biden plan actually would dwarf that on a per capita basis, about 3 or 4 times the size. So where's all that money going in the work of the task force? And really, what we concluded is that there were 4 big areas that we needed to focus on. And this was really aligned, again, looking both top down and bottom up, looking at what were we seeing internationally, what were we seeing in the international research, but also what were we seeing in proposals and ideas from across Canada. And the big 4, are really investments in buildings and retrofitted buildings, which some other policymakers in Europe have said to me, they call it the no-brainer of the pandemic recovery, that really when it comes to measures that are good for the economy and good for the environment, investing in building retrofits, gets people back to work, improves energy emissions, energy efficiency, and reduces emissions as well. Another big push is transportation. Again, in North America, and the focus on zero-emission vehicles. A lot of folks in North America aren't aware of how fast this change is coming in other parts of the world, especially in Europe. And then investments in clean energy, both in electrification, but also investment in new areas like hydrogen. And then finally, investments in nature, which have been shown to be to have good economic and environmental multipliers. And also are important for climate resilience in the future. So and this was my last slide, the scale of the investment that we came up with was about $55 billion, with half of it being in energy efficient buildings. Maybe just to step back now, because I know this crowd might be a little less interested in the details of this. Of course, I'm happy to go into it in the discussion, but maybe a comment more applicable to this panel. Again, this came together rather organically from a fairly broad cross-section of people who had a common interest. Its impact, I think we were pleased with. We got pretty good traction in that as we briefed ministers and others in government. Many of the themes that we echoed here, if you look at the speech from the throne from this government, you'll see that their 3rd pillar on a resilient recovery is very consistent with a lot of this. And certainly some of the early investments, announcements, and things around the Canada Infrastructure Bank have supported things like building retrofits. So for us, I think we felt that the approach was useful. I mean, we will have to wait and see as budgets come out this fall and this spring on exactly where this turns to. But the idea of convening a group, which could have been more diverse, but trying to create a fairly broad cross-section group that looked at the issues, that tried to look at best practices around the world, that tried to commit to a number of principles, but then also tried to tie it back to specific initiatives that were being proposed in Canada. We think it had some impact. And so, we continue to work with government and other players on the implementation of this. Our final report didn't just have these high-level recommendations. It's got, there's over 22 specific policy levers associated with these, and specific groups that are ready and performing some of that follow-up. So again, what I'd say, the lesson for me is, as we work towards a resilient recovery and work to address some of the issues that are topic of this panel, it's pretty clear that the challenges we face are too big for any one organization or even country to tackle alone. And so we're going to have to continue to find ways like the task force that bring together people on common cause to achieve the change we all want to see. So I hope that's a little bit of a thought starter, and back over to you, Christy. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Richard. I really like what you said about the signpost of partnerships ahead. And I actually recently completed my own PhD on the prospect of unlikely allies getting together on climate action. And I think that the Task Force for Resilient Recovery is a really good example of action in the face, a responsive action, despite an existing policy framework to do so in all of the areas that you've described. So thanks very much for that food for thought. And now I'd like to introduce Gretchen Goldman. Gretchen is the research director for the Center for Science and Democracy at the Union for Concerned Scientists. For nearly a decade, Dr. Goldman has led has led research efforts on the role of science in public policy, focusing on topics ranging from scientific integrity and policy interference to climate change and environmental justice. Dr. Goldman has testified before Congress and currently serves as an expert to the California Department of Conservation, UNESCO, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. In addition, she serves on multiple boards and committees such as the 500 Women Scientists Leadership Board. Her writing has appeared in leading journals and media outlets such as Science, Nature, the New York Times, and the BBC. She holds a PhD in environmental engineering from the Georgia Institute of Technology and a bachelor's degree in atmospheric science from Cornell. Gretchen, it is a great pleasure to have you with us today. The screen is yours.
Thank you, Christy. So we are at a pivotal moment in the world and in the US when it comes to democracy and climate change together. The US election put front and center the challenges that we face, both in terms of addressing the climate crisis and also really laid bare all of the democratic challenges we have around representation and voting and whether or not our democratic system is working for everyone involved. And in the short term, we anticipate having a science-friendly administration that will prioritize climate change and put it as a real focus point of the administration. President-elect Biden has put forth a very bold climate plan. It was far from the boldest of the candidates in this election. However, it is the strongest platform on climate that any president has had. So there's a lot of potential in the short term of things that we can do here. And this is very welcome given the recent history we've had. We've seen a lot of challenges happen in the past 4 years under the Trump administration, but even long before that, on thinking about how do we move forward on science-based policy and get climate action in a world where there are institutional barriers and tremendous political and private sector forces against taking aggressive action on climate. And so I want to do a quick summary of some history around that and what we've seen in the U.S. and what challenges we've faced. I think it's important to remember that science has never been a partisan issue. This wasn't something that we anticipated that a change in political party would mean a change in whether you'd accept science. Historically, that was never the case. We did, of course, always have instances where there were scientific integrity concerns or times where those in power misused science rather for the purposes of political gain. And we saw that under both major political parties at the federal level in the US. But it was always often, there were smaller instances. It was often covered and it was very clear when it was happening. Yet we saw under the Trump administration, this was taken to new heights. My organization, the Union of Concerned Scientists, has logged more than 170 attacks on science by the Trump administration. These are times that we noted where science was sidelined, ignored, manipulated in some way for political purposes. And I want to note that those are not just policy decisions. Presidential administrations, of course, have the right to set policy priorities, and we won't always make decisions based on science. There's lots of other reasons a decision maker might choose to take a certain path. But these were 170 times that the administration ignored science, either in a place that they were legally obligated to use it, there was not other factors to consider, or they blatantly interfered with the production or communication of science, such as gagging scientists, suppressing scientific reports from being released publicly. And so this is really an escalation of what we've seen. And in fact, we did a scientific paper looking at this, and we went back 7 decades to presidential administrations in the US and found that indeed the Trump administration was exceptional in its unprecedented level of attacks on science compared to past administrations. And so given that, we're seeing the Biden administration is being handed a very challenging situation around science and climate. We've seen all of those attacks on science. Those have had a very substantial impact on the morale and the capacity of scientists within the government. Many people have left government service. Many of the experts that we would normally rely on to help us address the climate crisis and do the research and science policy making that we need in this situation. And so that's going to be a big barrier, even in the context of a Biden administration coming in and choosing to prioritize climate change. It's going to be hard to do that when we don't have the experts in place to hit the ground running and do that to the best that we can. So that's something that's going to need to be addressed. We're going to need to boost up capacity and make sure that we do have the experts that are able to do that. We also saw in the last 4 years an abandonment of science advice. And this is external ways that the government gets input from the academic community to advise them on science. And this, there's a federal advisory committee system that works across federal agencies, across issue areas. And that is an important way that the government gets independent science advice on climate change and many other complex science issues. And that system is going to need to be rebuilt to some degree because of its dismissal and lack of use under the Trump administration. We've seen it be largely dormant on many key issues. And when it comes to climate change specifically, we've also seen very specific challenges that will make it harder when the Biden administration comes in. The obvious one is, of course, the lost time. These are, as we all know, very critical years for us to be working on climate change and thinking big about how to address it. And the longer that we wait, the harder it is going to be for us to address these challenges. And we've also seen, of course, damage to the U.S.'s international image and our ability to lead the world on these issues. And so the administration is going to have to build back trust and relationships on that front. And we've also seen a lot of very specific suppression of climate science and climate communication across the government. There's been a lot of censorship as well as self-censorship from government scientists who have opted not to work on climate or not to talk about climate because of fear of retaliation from the administration. So we're handed a really damaged system, and a Biden administration will need to come in and really think about how to tackle that, strengthening our own ability to respond, as well as working externally to ensure we can be good partners internationally on this. And the other major challenge that he'll face is, of course, that he's being handed this situation with a deeply divided nation. And opportunities on climate will be limited if Congress is obstructing in the way that it has in recent years around climate policy. And we also have a Supreme Court that has put up indications that it might not allow climate-related policies to go through if there's any sort of way it can be legally challenged. And so that's going to limit the kinds of things that a Biden administration could do. But there are opportunities even within that space for things that we can do. And I hope we get into that in this conversation. On the positive side, I'll just say that we have a huge increased momentum around climate action in the US. It's a new context than it was years ago when we were trying to advance climate change with a an administration that was interested in listening. We've seen a lot of changes since then. The economics are different around clean energy. The politics around climate are a little different. And we're seeing that the climate movement is much stronger, it's much bigger, and it's much more intersectional than it was years ago. We have broader coalitions. Climate is on the political agenda more than it ever was before. And we're seeing a lot of new leaders and more impact come into play in bigger ways, in more powerful ways than we've seen before. This is most notably coming from grassroots groups, many groups led by people of color, and the youth movement, which have all helped put climate on the agenda in new ways and in new places that we haven't seen before. And so even though this is all happening at the time that there's also increased pressure from the private sector on climate change. And in some ways, there's increased opposition from many powerful forces, including the fossil fuel industry, which has long obstructed climate progress in the US. We're seeing them start to lose some of that power now. There's many legal suits happening around fossil fuel industry and their the degree to which climate damages can be attributed to those companies who knew about climate change and the harms that it caused for decades, but hid it from the public and in fact spread disinformation to prevent any actions being taken on climate change. And so we're seeing a lot of those situations bubble up. And I think that will change a lot of the dynamics and a lot of the power structures that have until now hindered our ability to get good climate progress onto the agenda. And lastly, I'll just say that we have seen that there's been much talk recently now since the Biden election that now we can get to work and now we can start working on climate. But I want to note how much work it took to prevent bad things from happening in recent years. It's now hopefully the work can move us forward, but there was also a tremendous amount of work that went into preventing even worse things from happening in the past 4 years to ensure that science and scientists could continue to be focused and be able to do their job around this work. So I'm hopeful that the work can continue, and I look forward to the discussion.
Great, thanks so much, Gretchen. And as we all, or perhaps those in my chamber, collectively breathe a sigh of relief about the results of the recent election, I think that the picture that you paint is still one of a decision and action constrained environment, but one with hope. Around, the distribution of power, the potential for greater distribution of power and more voices coming to the fore, and indeed quite a strong platform for the new administration. And so, one might call something like this a situation or a context of decision-making bricolage, making do with what we have at hand. And I think there's something to watch there and for your organization and others like yours to do more good work in that domain. Thank you. So now I'd like to introduce to our virtual room here Salim Fakir. He's the Executive Director of the African Climate Foundation and a friend. Prior to establishing the ACF, Salim served as the head of policy and futures unit of WWF South Africa for 11 years and 8 years as the director of the World Conservation Union in South Africa. Salim has also spent a period at Stellenbosch University, where he worked as a senior lecturer in the Department of Public Administration and Planning and associate director for the Center for Renewable and Sustainable Energy. He has served on a number of boards and is a prolific writer who contributes regularly to leading national publications in the country of South Africa, like Engineering News, Business Day, and the Daily Maverick. A warm welcome to you, Salim, and special thanks not only for joining us for this discussion, but at such a late hour for you in South Africa. The screen is yours.
Thank you, Christy, and it's really wonderful to be virtually in Canada. So thanks for the invitation. I think what I want to do is really try to cover sort of the relationship between democracy, autocracy, and climate change issues, particularly from a public choice point of view. So mine is really trying to set out the broad parameters of our understanding of democracy and the prevalence of autocracy in the current context that we're living in. Let me start off by saying illiberalism may be on the rise, but democracy is still a practice that should be dear to us because we have no other civil ways to mediate life's complexities, multitudes, and the construction of a civilization that is built on peace and mutual respect. It's best to say that we have an imperfect instrument, work in progress, and must be by now awakened to the fact that the vision of democracy cannot be handed over to a few, but is a collective responsibility that we all have to take charge of. We are going through the most challenging period globally as far as the high stakes of preserving progressive democratic culture goes, and you've seen what has happened in the US. I think just to point out a deflection that is prevalent, one of the fundamental juxtaposition happening in the media today is to create the illusion that the only form of authoritarianism that exists in the world is in China, Russia, or some other place, but is not prevalent in our own world, this place of liberal and democratic societies. This is because the true nature of the web of power is not visible to us, and how autocracy manifests in hidden ways, which is not always made visible to us by the mainstream media. The degree of autocratization around the world, as measured by the Swedish group called VDEM, which is the Varieties of Democracy, provides us with a good longitudinal picture as they have examined data covering a period of close to a century. This is what they find in their latest report, Autocratization, the decline of democratic traits around the world has accelerated in the world. For the first time since 2001, autocracies are in the majority. 92 countries, which are home to 54% of the global population. Almost 35% of the world's population live in autocratizing nations, about 2.6 billion. Most of these tendencies are happening in well-established democracies like the USA, Turkey, Brazil, India, and some countries within the EU. Some specific mention is made of Hungary and Poland, and we may just have in South Africa just escaped the last 9 years of the Zuma era. They have had fundamental effect on climate policy and multilateralism as these countries have become more autocratic in their nature. You could see that with the US, Turkey, Brazil, and certainly India. But even in this period of despondency, there's good news. The VDEM report for 2019 also notes pro-democracy resistance grows from 27% in 2009 to 44% in 2019 amidst all this autocratic surge. During 2019, citizens in 29 democracies mobilized against autocratic regimes. And this is becoming a phenomena. This phenomenon of resistance is growing as autocratic governments grow. There is a paradox of democracy in that in most countries, electoral politics can only be undertaken if individuals and political parties are well funded. Those that are well funded tend to also take the largest share of political resources to diminish the prospects of plural representation and for alternate parties and ideas to shape the nature of public discourse and options that are on the table. I think if you can see the radical shifts in climate policy in the US, that's an example of some of the paradox of democracy. Money power does not only determine who we have as political representatives, but also the kinds of truths that we can be told, the type of ideas for well-functioning civic society, and the public choices that we can make, whether we build more coal plants or go to cleaner solutions, whether the state has the muscle to defend citizens from corporate lies, when they hide critical scientific information, so much so that if the public got to know the truth, they would fight for alternatives and ensure public funds do not go into more subsidies to extract fossil fuels. An interesting book by the scholar Robert Dahl. I have to be careful I don't call him Roald Dahl, who's the novelist and the writer of children's story. He's a well-known scholar on democracy, has long ago written about this issue, and in the title of his book called After the Revolution, Authority in a Good Society. It is worth quoting him as he makes some salient points that are quite relevant for today. Dahl writes, where democratic institutions have been around for a long time, not all forms of authority are necessarily democratic. And then further, in all democratic countries, some kinds of organizations are explicitly and even legally governed by systems of non-democratic authority. And he mentions here business firms as an example. Dahl notes further that when society is unequal, authoritarian tendencies are likely to flourish. He notes the rich, if they are fearful of the poor, the rich will impose oligarchy, while the poor, fearful of the rich, will be mobilized by a popular despot. I think this picture is quite familiar to us today, as we have seen the rise of populism, and we have seen also the rise of plutocracies. Autocracy ought not to be the visible stuff, but we must also see the hidden web of democracy as it is fashioned and shaped by powerful and yet undemocratic institutions in our society. One of these is all too well known to us, and Dahl calls the problem of concentrated private economic power as one form of this manifestation of the buildup of autocratic forms of hidden power that exert influence of the state and society. It is just to finally, end off. If we are to understand how apparent and hidden power and autocracy works, we can make more visible the web of their influence in shaping voter opinion, the ability to corrupt scientific evidence, as Gretchen has just noted, and in doing so, only to ensure that nothing is done about environmental threats, and to invade public instruments of democratic accountability and participation with their own framing of the world and orchestrating a coterie of supposed independent experts to shape the way we see truth and interpret evidence. The task ahead of us is that we have to recognize that our ability to deal with climate change challenge is to enhance the organization of civic action, not only in the premise of democratizing climate politics, but also serving as a countervailing force to the concentration of power that is entrenching inequality in a much wider terrain of public life. This is where the Greens must unite with those fighting for more equality and greater role of the state to break the back of structural inequality. We can see the influence and power of this form of progressive democracy when Greens unite with others in what's playing out in the European situation on a continental basis. Democracy is at a crossroads, not because it is a bad idea, but because we have allowed corrupt politicians and corporations to steal the vote and to usurp the instruments of accountability. I think the picture that I try to draw on here is that it is far too easy to assume that if you got visible democratic institutions, that you do not see the cobweb of hidden power and how this hidden power shapes and effectively dismantles democratic ideals and progressive culture through undemocratic forms of autocracy. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Salim. And I think I like where you ended there on the idea of a democracy and the realities perhaps of an unreflected of the lack of reflection upon the idea that is democracy. And and the need perhaps for us to think more about not only the responsibilities of those in power or who we put in power, but of ourselves and in keeping that in check. And I think that when it comes to a country like South Africa, the work of civic action in the face of inequality and as a countervailing force is one that you have a proud history of and have a lot to say about it. And so I thank you very much for that submission. And now I will go on to introduce Edward Parson, or as he goes by, Ted. Ted Parson is the Dan and Ray Emmett Professor of Environmental Law and Faculty Co-Director of the Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the University of California, Los Angeles. He studies international environmental law and policy, the role of science and technology in policymaking, and the political economy of regulation. His articles have appeared in, among others, Science, Nature, the Journal of Economic Literature, and the Annual Review of Energy and the Environment. His most recent books include The Science and Politics of Climate Change with Andrew Dessler and Protecting the Ozone Layer, Science and Strategy, which won the 2004 Sprout Award of the International Studies Association and is widely recognized as the authoritative account of the development of international cooperation to protect the ozone layer. Ted, thanks very much for being here today, and the screen is yours.
Thanks very much, Christy, and thanks to the other panelists and the organizers of the event. Now, Christy asked me to go big and deal with the largest scale question: can democracies deal with climate change? Or for that matter, we should say, can they deal with climate change and other looming global scale environmental threats? Because climate is the first and most prominent, but not the only one. Although, Salim, I very much appreciated your turn to the direction of kind of unpacking what it means to be a democracy and trans-threatening democracy. So you've also gone big and given a lot of food for thought for inflections of my remarks. So I look forward to the discussion. So to give a useful answer to the question, can democracies effectively deal with climate change? It's necessary to dig at least a little into the two questions: what's a democracy and what does it actually mean to handle or manage climate change? Neither of these is easy. They go all the way down. I'll comment briefly on each of them. Among the many dimensions on which democracies vary, I would submit that the most important one for thinking about climate change is the balance of and the relationship between popular will and expert evidence-based knowledge in determining political outcomes. Now, reflecting on Salim's remark, I have to add, of course, these are not the only bases for power in a state. And of course, arguing about the balance between legitimate democratic popular will and expert-based, evidence-based decision-making excludes the third column, which is unaccountable, self-interested elites. So we will have to deal with those as well. Thinking only about the sort of expertise in democracy dimension, first, we have to note these are in tension in most political systems and in pretty much all democratic ones. John Dewey explored this with great subtlety more than a century ago, and as Salim mentioned, Robert Dahl has done so more recently. The trends on this are funny and confusing. So on the one hand, the world is filling up with information, with evidence, with expertise, even as prevailing normative views among progressives for a few decades, but now joined by a lot on the right with the rise of internet-fueled populist regimes in the last decade, show great and increasing hostility to expertise as part of a general hostility toward elites more broadly. To be a little glib, I want to say it's too bad technocracy got such a bad name, because it is probably necessary to rehabilitate it, because a healthy society needs both these strains, the popular democratic and the disciplined based on evidence mobilized by expertise. In some sense, the relationships between where each of these gets their legitimate authority are kind of obvious. You don't want technical experts dictating what's a fair distribution of tax burden or how much society should spend on health and education versus national defense. On the other hand, you don't want popular sentiment making authoritative determinations of things like the transmissibility of COVID, the safety and efficacy of vaccines, the sensitivity of the global climate, or for that matter, how to operate a stable electrical grid. As Gretchen suggested, science can tell you descriptions of what is and analyses of what causes what, which are relevant to actions because they speak to consequences of alternative actions. But science, or empirical knowledge advanced by science, is never sufficient to tell you what to do. That takes additional normative or principled commitments. So I would like to propose that one necessary condition for governments being able to governments and societies, because I'm not speaking exclusively about state power, to effectively address climate change will be a re-strengthening of the capacity of states for effective, well-informed action based upon expertise and empirical evidence. Now, none of this is going to be easy. And indeed, addressing climate change is not easy in any form of state. There are basic structural characteristics of the climate issue that make the problem hard for any human institution to respond effectively, perhaps even harder in institutional structures that are dominated by popular will, and so that have underweighted evidence and expertise, and maybe hardest of all for states that are effectively dominated by commercial interests that depend on the activities causing the problem, i.e. the fossil fuel economy. So I said 4 structural characteristics of climate change that make it hard. It's global, it's slow, it's uncertain, and it presents no clear adversary. A moment of detail on each of those. Climate change is global. This is essentially a truism. But it's global in 2 senses. First, because emissions anywhere contribute to climate change everywhere, the problem is driven by the aggregation of billions of environmental insults, small and large, that reflect billions of individual choices. It's also global in the sense that the extremity of possible outcomes on climate change means the whole world faces a linked fate. For the moment, lucky people in likely places may be doing better than others, although that's not entirely the case even under currently evident climate change. There are unlikely to be any winners under upper bound projections of climate change, unless you redefine winning and losing to be only in relative terms. Now, what the global nature of climate means is that it requires a capacity for coordinated action at a bigger scale than individual nation states. Second, it opens up limitless possibilities for blame shifting, for people and organizations and states to avoid their own duty to act by alleging that others are not doing their share. And 3, it requires extending our boundaries of moral concern to include people far away who live and look differently from us. Second structural characteristic of climate change, it's slow. The climate system responds slowly, the world energy system changes slowly. It moves slowly. Patterns and causation are slow to reveal themselves, and it's slow to change or deflect trends once they're underway. Climate change is a train wreck happening in cinematic slow motion. I want you to think for a moment and visualize that and think about the difficulty of stopping such a thing underway. Now, the slow dynamics of climate change mean that first, effectively managing it requires effort and sacrifice now, mainly directed to benefits that will accrue some decades into the future. Second, it means that it will require continued effort through a decades-long transformation, even while it looks like the efforts are not doing anything because the changes and impacts are still getting worse. Third structural characteristic, climate change is uncertain, not in the exaggerated sense that the climate deniers say, alleging that we don't know whether it's real, we don't know whether it's human caused, we don't know whether it's going to be big enough to be important. Those foundational points of knowledge are established as certainly as anything in science. But it is uncertain in the detailed timing, location, character, and severity of the coming changes and impacts, even in the zeroth order sense of not knowing how bad it'll be overall to within a factor of 3 or 4, and also in many elements of what to do about it. So we see fabulous technical progress underway in some areas like solar and wind electricity and like penetration of electric vehicles, but much less and much harder technical problems in other pieces of the whole problem. And it is necessary to solve the whole problem, not just the easy sectors in the real places. Now, each of these four characteristics has implications for how to respond and for the capability of different kinds of government institutions, in particular democratic ones. What uncertainty means is that you can't see and verify directly what's happening or why it's happening. And so there is a need to rely on scientific experts, including their projections of future changes. Second, specific projections of what's going to happen might well be valid, but turn out to be mistaken. And thus, in a political decision environment, there's always the risk of mistaken former projections being taken as a basis for discrediting knowledge or expertise, when in fact there is real knowledge and expertise. And then finally, uncertainty makes the issue subject to self-interested parties selling false claims to mislead decision-making. Those occur more prominently on the side of opponents of climate action, but they are not absent on the side of advocates of climate action either. On the one side, you have the false claims, oh, this isn't real, it's not a problem, it's just natural, we're not causing it, it's not going to be that bad. And on the other side, you have, if not outright false, then at least wildly optimistic claims of the form, oh, this will be easy to solve, it won't take hard choices or sacrifices. Final structural characteristic that makes it hard, climate change presents no clear, prominent adversary. The causes of climate change are embedded throughout modern societies and economies. The world still relies 84% on fossil fuels for its primary energy. It's all of us. The lack of a prominent adversary to mobilize popular sentiment, whether that sentiment is noble or base, frustrates simple analogies of wartime mobilization. Yes, America turned the economy around in less than 1 year to mobilize to fight World War II. No, that is probably not a helpful analogy for what must be done and the prospects and methods for doing it for global climate change. And yet this fourth characteristic has some ambiguity. At the same time, those actors who have the strongest stakes in present conduct that's causing the problem, they're relatively concentrated. The enterprises, the workers, and the governments that depend upon extracting, selling, and especially exporting fossil fuels. Here in Canada, we would speak about the provincial government of Alberta, although it's not exclusively Alberta. In political terms, we might actually be in the worst situation of all here, in that the actors who will be the main ones whose conduct must be changed by collective action, they are so big and numerous and powerful and mobilized as to be formidable political opponents. And indeed, the fossil interests have won since 1990. I mean, it is not the only explanation, but one explanation for why we're in such a dire state now is the success of this faction at obstructing action. On the other hand, these people are not so singular, so other, so separate from all of us, that they make a good villain to motivate and sustain effort through what's going to be a difficult multi-decade program of transformation. And indeed, even if it turns out that way, even if they do get framed as villains and adversity to them becomes a motivating factor, that doesn't actually lead to pressure to move in the most constructive directions. Let me turn quickly to I've talked about structural problems. Let me talk briefly in closing about the major elements of how to respond to climate change, what it means to manage it effectively. And I'm going to skip over a couple of things that are really important because I have so little time. First, since the earliest days of climate debate, there's been a long-standing taxonomy of people understanding what the main responses are. Mitigation, which is a not really good word for cutting the emissions causing it. And adaptation means changes to reduce the harm actually experienced from changes that happen. Over the past 5 to 10 years, there have been 2 additional responses added to that, and they make a huge difference in the feasibility and the challenges of responding. Carbon dioxide removal, or removal of CO2 or other greenhouse gases from the atmosphere after emitted. This is like kind of extra extreme mitigation. Or geoengineering or radiation modification. technological intentional interventions that, that control the radiation balance between the Earth and the sun. This is sort of like extreme adaptation, although people resist that characterization. On mitigation, most of my prior comments on the structure of the problem pertain mainly to mitigation. Cutting emissions to zero is essential and is the first step to do anything to manage climate change. Mitigation is also the locus of the biggest tragedy. It would have been possible to hold climate change to reasonably prudent limits if we had all started together in 1990 when we knew enough to justify that action, but that didn't happen. And so here we are 30 years later, 30 years deeper in a hole, in a situation where the Paris targets of holding heating to 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius require cuts so rapid that total cumulative emissions until they stop forever are somewhere between 5 and 25 years at the present rates of emissions. But emissions are still growing. I mean, except for a small reduction just in the past year in COVID, global emissions, they continue to grow since we knew, since around 1990. The rapidity of cuts necessary to achieve the Paris targets, it's hard to say impossible about anything in the domain of political or social action, but this is pretty close to impossible. And now we have evidence coming, in particular from Arctic regions, of positive feedbacks being mobilized naturally, such that there may be additional increases of natural emissions triggered by climate change that will make it even harder. So we're in a deep hole. On the other hand, climate change is not driving off a cliff. There is no single known point of catastrophe or point of no return. It just gets worse and worse for everyone and everything the further out we go. And consequently, even if present efforts on mitigation are fighting to hold heating to 2.5 degrees rather than 3, or to 3 rather than 4, these differences represent enormous differences for human welfare and ecosystems, and they're absolutely worth doing, even if we have missed the chance to achieve the more ambitious targets. I'm not going to speak about adaptation because I don't have time. Carbon dioxide removal is the new kid in town. Since Paris, the debate has shifted to net emissions based upon removals of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. This is a huge advance in risk response capability. It is absolutely exciting and to be celebrated. If removals proceed at a big enough scale, they actually introduce the possibility of drawing down the current atmospheric concentration and so moving climate change backwards. But there's plenty of need for caution on these options. Very briefly, the Paris scenarios assume extraordinary withdrawals later this century. It's like a picture of spending yourself deep into debt now and then relying on paying it back in 50 years, and it's an enormous gamble. Second, the required scale up to do this is unbelievable, and at scale, these options are not likely to be cheap or even necessarily benign in their impacts. And third, these interventions are slow. They're probably too slow to prevent the big heating that we're going to face over the next several decades. At Paris and the analyses around that, many temperature targets got redefined as overshoot targets, meaning you could say you meet the target if you exceed the temperature and then eventually come back to it. That's cheating, and it doesn't avoid the risks. Last point to make, the last option class, solar geoengineering or climate intervention or radiation modification, there are identified technical options that look promising in their ability to rapidly cool the Earth and do so in a way that is close to uniform. The main one would involve spraying reflective aerosols in the upper atmosphere to make the Earth a little brighter. This is very promising. In my first paper on this more than 10 years ago, my co-author and I used the terms fast, cheap, imperfect to describe these. That's still pretty valid. They can't replace other options, but they can substantially extend the capacity to manage risks in ways that emission cutting and carbon dioxide removal simply cannot do. These are also scary. They introduce plenty of serious new risks. These are mainly related to governance issues of how they would be used and controlled, but there's still big promise. These interventions have been pretty much blocked even in initial research investigation thus far, dismissed as a dangerous distraction. on variable grounds that are related to ideology, selective precaution, or suspicion of the people who are talking about it. But none of these warrants ignoring these. So let me close with a prediction and an opinion. And I'm sorry for going a little over. Here's my prediction. I'd actually be willing to bet money on this. Someone, some nation or nations will do this, and they will do it within something like my remaining lifetime. And I'm not that young, 25 years or so. There are plenty of scenarios of how this might happen. They mostly relate to a vulnerable country in a state of desperation. There's interesting explorations of these in fiction as well. So there's my prediction. And then my opinion, less confident, but still pretty strong. Given the severity of climate risks and the limits of other responses, doing climate interventions, engineered radiation interventions, is likely on balance to be less bad for human welfare and for the environment than not doing it. The implications of this are not that anybody should start doing this now, but that there is a need for a huge increase in research investigation of these to characterize whether they work and what risks they pose, and a huge increase in government and society paying attention and engaging in consultations, domestic and international, about what it would mean, how it relates to climate change more broadly, and how to limit the risks it poses. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Ted. I think that was a great analysis to sort of round out our conversation today, and I think that the four kind of organizing principles of what makes this difficult, global, it's slow, it's uncertain, and there's no clear adversary, are really important points for us to think about. And I know from social movement theory that often the scholarship points to where there is no clear adversary, that it really limits the effectiveness of social movements and their ability to really organize in a specific and dedicated way. And I think the point about geoengineering and new technologies is one that makes me think about adaptation as well, in the sense that I'm an adaptation person, and there's a time in climate discourse when people said, well, if you talk about adaptation, you're giving up on mitigation. And so if we talk about geoengineering, are we giving up on everything else? And I think you've made a strong argument that that's not necessarily the case here. So to the audience, what I'd like to say is please think about using the Q&A function here in the chat, and I invite all of the panelists to put their videos back on for us to have a little bit of a discussion. Great. All we're missing is Gretchen. Perfect. Okay, super. So here's what I'm going to start with. One of my questions, which is about the power of grassroots organizing, right? So the picture has been painted of all of the sort of complexities that abound with firm and decisive action, with policy making and popular will on climate change, and the tensions that creates in terms of the time horizon that we have to do something. And so what I'd like to hear a couple of comments on is your thoughts on how grassroots efforts not only can change the fate of a country, like perhaps we've seen in the US most recently, but also in terms of getting things done in the shorter term on climate. Does anyone have any thoughts on that? Gretchen?
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that. So certainly what jumps to mind is the recent election and the fact that we did see the impact of grassroots organizing and getting out the vote, and that did, in fact, swing the election in many ways, because there was this strong ground game in ensuring that people were engaged in the election. I think for climate, I think there's huge potential on this, because we are in such a divided place, and there is so much, we're in such a misinformation-rich media environment, that anytime we can have more face-to-face conversations, obviously more challenging during COVID, but there's lots of potential to use that to engage new people, bring new people into the conversation. And I think in the US, we've seen a lot of benefits of organizers having done that, and broadening the table of who is in the conversation and can influence it. And I think ultimately that will put us in a much better place when there is an opportunity to do bigger federal action, because we've involved more people. And importantly, we've involved them from the start of the process. Because one thing that I think has been challenging in the past is, there's often been a goal, decision makers working toward that, and then, they later will try to bring on board groups like environmental justice groups and others. But if it's too late in the game and it's viewed as an afterthought, that's not going to be as effective of an engagement tool. And I think the climate movement has learned a lot about how to do that better and get the right people at the table from the start, ensure you are doing things that are mutually beneficial, and it is leading in a way that affected voices are centered, because we know this issue will have winners and losers in terms of who's affected by the impacts of climate change. And those most affected need to be at the decision-making table and able to help influence what we end up doing.
Thank you. Perfect. So now, Salim, I'd like you to reflect on this question. My experience of traveling to different parts of the world and working on climate is that, there's parts of the world where climate is here and now. Climate is something that is yesterday, and that we need to adapt to and show resilience to every day. And for others, it's about something that's coming. And I would put many of the countries in Africa in the former category. And I wonder if there's something that we can learn from organizing outside of these kind of more determinative frameworks in that space.
Yeah, no, thanks. I think we as a foundation, as a new foundation, we're grappling with this particular issue. And we've kind of taken a view that you can't develop a notion of climate resilience if you don't look at this in a more broader context. For example, one of the fundamental pillars of our work when we think about climate resilience is we try to think about this in a more rights-based approach, which is influenced by the works of John Rawls, Amartya Sen, and Martha Nussbaum. And effectively, we argue that there are fundamental political rights that have to be defended. They're important for political organization, grassroots organization, and basic civil liberties. And then there are second-order rights, which are socioeconomic rights. And if you are able to strengthen these, it makes it much more easier to build a more climate resilient set of pillars, because the enabling scaffold are these basic foundational first order and second order rights. If you don't have them in society, then you leave effectively the climate resilient model is vacuous, because it doesn't address these two core pillars, in my view, that are fundamental to how societies enable themselves to claim the means to exercise capabilities and opportunities, and in which they not only individual but also community rights and other broader social ways of organizing are tied to how these rights are defended and protected over time. So climate resilience has to be seen in that context and not in the absence of that context.
Great, thanks.
If I may comment on your question about social movements too. So every government depends upon some degree of consent and support from the citizens. Actually, that's even the case for non-democratic governments. It's very powerfully the case for any democratic governments. And so there's a sense in which kind of popular mobilization, popular arousal is always powerful and sometimes necessary to achieve substantial action. but it's more powerful on some issues than others. It's more powerful on issues that have a very strong moral dimension that is very simple to communicate and apprehend. It's more powerful on issues where there's a profound need for a kind of a single, like a phase change in collective decision making. The structural difficulties of climate change, I think, they raise some challenges, or they delimit the role for popular mobilization in some respects. Because I want to ask, okay, there's a massive worldwide popular uprising for climate change. What is it that they're asking for? What do they demand? Here, I can be a little flip and glib and say a massive worldwide popular uprising demanding a uniform $100 a ton carbon tax upon all life cycle emitters. No. In fact, there was a little political drama in the state of Washington that sort of tested that, the technocratic policy vision as opposed to the grassroots mobilization, and it failed. So what do they demand? How do they get their information to inform what they demand? And how do they keep up the pressure and the demand for the 50 to 100 years of continued thought, analysis, investment, innovation, effort, and sacrifice that is necessary to go through the transformation to a climate-safe society? So I'm arguing on one hand, other hand. The other thing I'll say is popular mobilization, grassroots movements, they can and do deploy very powerful symbols. And the most important way they do that is they vividly illustrate the need to broaden the moral universe of concern. So that applies to the sort of we're all in this together, we're all in the same boat issue. It also applies to the generational issue. So the most powerful and positive news on climate in the past few years has been the intensity of the mobilization of not just young adults and adolescents, but young adults, adolescents, and children, who, some of whom, with effective support and briefing, are being extremely effective at kind of symbolizing the long tail of consequences that is neglected by present decision makers. So that's fabulous. It's really promising, but don't count on them. You know, it's like Greta Thunberg, even, she doesn't get it all right. I mean, when she says science has said we have just 10 years to save the world for catastrophe, that's great TV, but that is a mischaracterization of what we know about the issue and what must be done about it. And the true characterization is less vivid and dramatic.
Thanks, Ted. Okay, I'm going to shift gears here a little bit, and I'm going to try and connect a question that's come up in the Q&A with one of my own, and that is, back in 2010, and I was working with a group of people who was really trying to organize around the green economy and the Green New Deal that was, that many were being called for on the back of the financial crisis in 2008. And Richard, of course, the work of the Task Force for Resilient Recovery is trying to make a similar go of things. And Ted, you said something in your comments about why trying to organize a sort of wartime response might not work in the context of the climate crisis. And so the question is, what's different? What's different from 2008? What's different from what's different from 2008 in terms of sort of using stimulus packages to have a response? And the question in the chat is really looking at where in these other places you have examples of things like degrowth or donut economics, and how those aren't really being seen as legitimate questions here in North America. So I'm going to hand that basket of issues first over to you, Richard, and then we'll see if
thank you. Very happy to, and such important conversations. Look, I think what I'd say on that last intervention between Gretchen and Ted, and I know they weren't really opposing views, but I think on all of this, when it comes to grassroots, what I'd say is, necessary but not sufficient. In other words, we have to get to an and, right? Let's be inspired by the very environment that we're trying to improve, which is we care what's in the soil and what's in the sky. It has to be both bottom up and top down. We need both, and one alone isn't sufficient for all the reasons that Ted outlined. From my perspective, what I think is different, and I really feel this because I did some work on energy. Well, some of you would be much more experienced than me, but back in 08, 09, out of that recession. And here's what I think feels different. One is, of course, grassroots and public awareness. Like, I used to be a university president. Let's recognize this is the defining issue for this generation of youth. So that's probably number one. That's the biggest difference, right? This is higher on the political agenda. But of course, and this comes back to top down and the macroeconomic forces and economic self-interest. The other big thing I think that really knocked the wind out of the sails of a green recovery in the last recession was the shale gas revolution. I just felt that, I remember in the early aughts, people were saying there'll never be another gas-fired electricity plant built. Remember when natural gas prices were really high before fracking? But then fracking came along and it just, boom, it was like, people before that had been talking about a nuclear renaissance, and all of a sudden it became, hey, we can switch from coal to gas, cut our emissions to half and save money, and it's quick to build. It was like that gas revolution, and I won't get into the details of it, but that economic self-interest it was like a wave. It was like such a strong thing to fight. And I think that was a really defining issue on why carbon pricing didn't happen and why the green revolution didn't happen as much. The final thing I'd say, and this relates to grassroots, is that what's really different this time is that in addition with the public awareness, there's a broader kind of, even in the corporate sector, a better awareness of these issues. And there's a few data points around that, right? You can look at corporate social responsibility budgets, and I've had some colleagues in the university looking at this, that people thought they'd go down in the pandemic. They'd not just stayed the same, they actually have gone up. You see boards of directors now, that climate has become a top issue. You see people who are saying, insurers who are saying, this is like a critical business issue. We're not going to insure you on that waterfront anymore. So it really has become, climate has become, and I'm not minimizing any of the environmental concerns because that's why I'm here, but it's also become a balance sheet and an economic issue, right? In a way that it wasn't it wasn't so apparent a decade ago, that climate is starting to get interwoven into international finance. It makes a difference. And, for me, a positive sign, another positive evidence to build my argument is, even before this election, during Climate Week in New York, I wonder if some of you heard that Walmart Sustainability Summit in September. And there you had the CEO of Walmart, okay? And there's lots of thoughts on Walmart as a corporation. But there you had the CEO of Walmart saying, we can't really rely on government for this. You know what? We're committing to net zero by 2040 with no offsets. We're going to pursue battery vehicles, hydrogen, all these solutions. And in a way that if you listen to that speech, you'd say, my goodness, like even 2 years ago, you'd think, well, is that kind of a left-wing radical? Like who got into the boardroom here? Now, I'm not trying to be Pollyannish and saying everything's going to change, but that's quite a remarkable difference from a decade ago. So those are the three things I'd say: the grassroots attention and just demography, the shale gas revolution that really pushed things backwards, and I think the interest in the corporate world on recognition of climate issues.
Great. Okay. Ted, I'm going to ask you if you have anything to add, but don't feel pressured to, because we do have some more questions here.
I don't feel pressured. I'm having trouble. How much volume and intensity to fill here.
Briefly, if you can.
Yeah. Okay. So if there's a wide range of degrees of technological optimism, there remains a happy story in which the transition to a zero emissions global economy takes place with such rapid and successful innovation across all fronts that even if it's too late to shave the hump of really bad climate change over the next 50 years, it does get to the other shore. And it does so in a way that doesn't sort of impoverish the world or require a revolutionary transformation of governing institutions. If that happy story, it does not, and that happy story, it's not a completely happy story. It might, if that turns out to be true, then fine. I mean, incremental policies, tons of new investments, corporate reorientation of values, great. if it turns out to be the case that the only way to have a stable climate in a human society involves a large reduction in the total level of material consumption of human beings, and I say material consumption to be intentionally ambiguous because I want to not get into the economists' decoupling argument here, although it's a very deep one. It's like, can you be rich with less stuff, less energy and less material moving around? If climate safe, sustainable world requires large aggregate reductions in that, then that is an additional and decisive reason that the intensity of inequality in the world has to be on the table. Internationally, domestically among individuals, and in terms of sort of the balance between labor and capital, or the corporate sector and the civil society sector. There's plenty of reason that that's close to a moral imperative already, given the rapidly increasing trends of inequity, even not considering environmental issues. But if we're going to have to live in a more constrained way in aggregate, then lucky rich people like us can't just keep talking about spaceship Earth and how we're all in this together and have to tighten our belts without taking serious account of how lucky and privileged we are in our levels of consumption and luxury relative to the vast majority of people in the world, even within our own countries, but especially internationally. And I don't know any historical examples of transformations that big that haven't been revolutionary and horrible for a long time until the subsequent new order stabilizes after the fact.
I like the revolutionary part. The other, but okay. I think there's a lot more that we could discuss, and I'm sorry that we don't have more time. And we have 6 more minutes before we have to close, and I'm gonna give each of you 1 minute to give us your final thoughts, and also the option of addressing a question that I'm going to take some creative license with in the question and answers around what it is that we can do, what society can do to counteract misinformation and the situation, particularly in the U.S. Around public opinion and the value of the Paris Agreement. So you may choose one or the other or both, but you need to do it in 1 minute. Let's start with you, Salim.
I knew you were going to go for that. I think that fundamentally, I believe that the world is in such a state of divide and there's a flourish of what I call a barbarism of prejudice, and effectively dismantling of any sense of truth, even if it comes from legitimate authority. People are driven by instinctive sense of that they need to defend certain forms of affiliation, if I may put it that way. It could be religious affiliation, it could be race, it could be ideological, and that's what the world we have today. And I think part of grassroots enabling and building the social infrastructure is to move away from that barbarism of prejudice to being able to create the kind of social infrastructure where meaningful and rational debate and constructive policy choices can be made. Converting social movements, having grassroots movements is insufficient. You must be able to convert it into a progressive political power. Otherwise, nothing will happen. And you need to build what Asimoglu in the book called Narrow Corridors talked about, is how we can define what a shackled Leviathan looks like, the state. And we have effectively dismantled many aspects of the social value of the state because it has been so corrupted by forms of political elitism and so on, that even the effectiveness of grassroots organization has been minimized as a result of that.
Thanks, Salim. I'm going to hand immediately over to you, Gretchen.
I'm going to address that question, but kind of somewhat flip it, which is to say that I think there's a lot of interest and focus on public opinion because as people who value knowledge, we really want people to have that acceptance of the science. But I I would question that being the goal, because that is not really how we've gotten big changes, right? It's not because we've convinced 100% of the public to feel this way. And if you look back through all social movements, anything on racial justice or gay marriage or anything that we've seen in recent years, and it's not that we've gotten most or even the majority of the population to agree on those points. It's that we've put political pressure in the right places such that decision makers are forced to act in that direction. And so I try to remind people on climate that this is also the point. And even though it would be very satisfying if we were able to, battle all of the misinformation and really convince our uncles that are climate deniers that like this is not the case, that really isn't necessarily the end goal. And so I think as far as what we can do as individuals and what the international community can do is think about, where are those pressure points, those incentives, where can we get other we can power map it. Who are other influential people that can be involved here? What kinds of levers can we use to get that change? And I'm hopeful that we have a lot of those levers, and there's a lot of different voices and groups of voices that can be influential in that regard. One thing I'm very hopeful about is the scientific community. They've stepped up in more ways than I could imagine in recent years, and I'm hopeful that will be influential in terms of getting policy action.
Thank you. Richard.
Boy, what can I say that hasn't been said? Maybe my head's still ringing with Ted's comments. Look, and he may be right in between what Ted and Gretchen have said, that there's some pretty big change we're talking about. And so the question is, can we tilt enough? And Gretchen, I've been thinking also about the very examples you mentioned, like approaches to same-sex marriage, which were a combination of democratic will, but then leadership shaping that will and tapping into it, and kind of grabbing that and then setting a new agenda that, frankly, thankfully, seems almost irreversible now. I mean, I shouldn't say that, but it's quite remarkable the changes we've made in the last decade or two. So, I guess what I'd say is if you present the world as Ted has suggested, there is an argument to be made that this is going to need some extreme, perhaps radical structural reform, but even if we believe that, I guess we owe it to ourselves to make our best effort to work within the system we've got. And I think that there is enough cause to be rational to pursue that, to say that some of the interest we're seeing, even relative back to your previous question, back to 2010, that we're seeing enough interest and positive momentum here that we should try to build on it. And so I would end with where I started, which is we've got to continue to look for new partnerships. And what I mean by that is we've got to try to find ways to broaden the tent consistent with our grassroots that we've talked about. And that means each of us maybe being a bit uncomfortable working with players that we might not have before, or investing in partners when we might want to invest in ourselves, and finding ways to find that common cause to tackle this. So thank you all for these very provocative thoughts and the opportunity to be part of the discussion. Thank you.
Great. And so we're going to go over just a couple of minutes. So I apologize for that to the audience, but I want to give the last word to Ted, and then I will close.
It is a target-rich environment. There are so many big and deep and hard questions on the table, so I'm going to have to be very selective. 2 or 3, maybe every one of you has pointed out that effective large-scale social change requires a multiplicity of diverse actors coming together. I think that is deeply true. I want to recommend a book. I'm only on one screen now, so I wasn't able to look up the author, but there is a brilliant historical book called Bury the Chains about abolitionism in 17th century England, how it came about. That basically makes the case that large-scale social change requires a coordinated confluence of elite and populist action with some degree of coordination. Perfect coordination can't do it. I think that's very much the case for all major issues. It's certainly the case for climate change. Control of information, control of disinformation, very, very difficult. So I live mostly in the United States, which is on the extreme endpoint in terms of valorizing kind of free speech at almost all cost. right? And based upon a reasonable hostility and worry about a state organization setting itself up as the Ministry of Truth to mediate, claims made in the public discourse, there are compromises. There have been historical compromises. There are jurisdictions that make rough and ready compromises in terms of reducing the extremity and the amplification of both the most hostile claims and the most crazy claims. It would be hard to do that in the United States legal environment. Last point, because I was asked to be provocative, I might have seemed to disparage the power of incremental change. Richard, I'm looking at you, more than I think is appropriate. I love incremental change in positive directions. It's just, individual action, ride your bike, adopt, a carbon tax, even if it's restricted in scope and not that extreme. These are good things as long as they don't foreclose bigger, better things, but they move us roughly in the right direction. So I guess I'm just also arguing, it's like, don't delude yourselves about what a deep hole we're in. It's a deep hole that's not even necessarily visible and obvious. So it's the hardest kind of all. There could be very bad things coming with climate impacts. And it could be that the need to make this effective response with all the actors contributing occurs in the context of bad things continuing to happen. So incremental, don't delude yourself that that's necessarily sufficient. Recognize technological optimism when it leads you to avoid hard questions, but still invest and innovate. And a little concretely, it's like, think about geoengineering. It's probably coming. It's probably coming, and it might be better that it comes than that it not comes, but it poses really severe risks and problems, and those need to be thought about in advance.
Wonderful. Thanks. I just wish we had hours and hours more to discuss this. And I know from my own perspective, but I think also on behalf of the audience, we have had wonderful conversation partners and thoughts and food for thought that we can take home with us. And I just really want to extend my gratitude to all of you for making yourself available for this conversation and bringing to us your expertise and your experience in this domain. So thank you. And as I close, I'd like to really just say to the audience that I co-chair this panel, or I co-chair this theme, and there is another session happening tomorrow at the forum at the same time that you might want to look up, and that's being led by my co-chair Thomas Homer Dixon. So look out for it for the program and see if you can register. Thank you, and good day. And Salim, good night.
Thank you all. It's been a pleasure.